I am Jackie Ng. I am coordinator for the Housing Affordability Coalition, and we are delighted to have you join us for this APFO webinar. The coalition, just as a little bit of background to us, for those of you who may not know us, we formed as a grassroots coalition in 2018. We now have 44 organizational members and almost 1,000 individual members and allies. We are appreciative of all of you. And if you haven't joined the coalition, we invite you to do so, and we'll let you know how to do that a little bit later. We have three basic functions. We monitor the legislation and what's happening in the housing world and best practices. We try to educate and advise through mechanisms such as this webinar this evening. And then we organize, as we've done, bringing 1,000 people together in our community who care about affordable housing. And then we advocate, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we can advocate around this issue a little bit later. And as a reminder of why we're here tonight, there is insufficient housing, affordable housing, and insufficient housing across all incomes, actually, throughout the nation, throughout the state, and throughout our community. And the reason for that unaffordability is the rising prices of homes. And here in our community, you can see we got $600,000 as a median price, and our average two-bedroom apartment is now running $2,625. And who is this impacting? This is impacting the people who are already most marginalized in our community. And it goes from seniors and people with disabilities, our public sector workforce, our teachers, our firefighters, our healthcare providers, young families, young adults particularly, many of whom were raised in the county and now not able to come back and live in the community they serve. And again, it's a lack of housing supply. Nationally, they're talking about a 3.2 million undersupply. And in our state, we're looking at 96,000 homes that, again, across income levels. And in Howard County, we have a current shortage of 20,000 homes. And our recent general plan update, HOCO by Design, projects that we're going to need another 31,000 homes by 2040 just to support the anticipated job growth that we're going to see. And sadly, of that $20,000 shortage of inventory, 9,000 of those affordable rentals are needed for households earning below 60% of our area median income. Tonight, we are going to talk about the Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance, APFO, and try to give some background. And we're going to talk about the broad view of our planning process and how APFO actually works, what we've seen with it working, with its function. We have some myths and misconceptions that we hear consistently that we would like to address. And then the coalition has a few recommendations that we think will improve APFO and improve it to the point of so that we can afford and manage both housing and schools and ensure that our community has the sufficient economic resources to sustain our current programs and services. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about how to advocate for APFO and our recommendations. Thank you. And I am now going to turn it over to Dana Soar, who is one of the Coalition Steering Committee members.
Thank you, Jackie. Good evening to everybody. In addition to my evening role on the Coalition Steering Committee, my daytime job is as Deputy Director at Bridges to Housing Stability. I've been in the county for 40 years, and I'm deeply concerned about the future of our county where we can't provide housing for people who need it, including children and grandchildren. So I'm going to take you through some context behind the recommendations that you'll hear a little bit later. I'm going to start with some of the key steps in the county's planning process. This may be very familiar to some of you, but I would wager that it is completely unfamiliar to many of you. So let's just start with three high-level steps that occur as the county figures out how it's going to manage growth and population increases and workforce growth. So the first step in the county's planning process is the general plan, which defines how many new homes can be built. Next comes the APFO Review Committee, which recommends ways to expand infrastructure to support that growth. And last are zoning regulations, which define what can be built and where. And let's just take a quick, brief look at each one of these. We'll start with the general plan. Our latest updates to our general plan were passed by the County Council a little more than 1 year ago. Those were called HOCO by design. Some of you may remember that name. And the plan lays out a vision for our community in many areas over the next 10 to 20 years, including a policy roadmap to support the growth in population and the workforce through the year 2040. And very importantly, it sets goals for new housing development, new homes, 1,740 of them every year, including, very importantly, 340 affordable homes for those families earning below 60% of area median income. These policy goals, which were approved by the County Council, were a direct response to the community's outcry during the hearings last year and other public meetings leading up to the Council's deliberations. An outcry from the people impacted by the housing shortage and the resulting increases in home prices and rents that Jackie just described. So that's our general plan. Let's skip to the end here and talk about zoning regulations, which at a very simplistic high level, they specify what can be built and where. You know, where is farmland going to be? Where are the parks? Where's the housing of different types and densities? And also, where will industry be located? So nothing so simple, right? In Howard County, this is the actual zoning map. Every colored splotch has its own zoning regulations that define what can be built and what activities are allowed in those areas. And note that the Department of Planning and Zoning, or DPZ, will be proposing updates to zoning regulations to support those housing development goals that were approved by the County Council in the general plan. We don't know the timing, it's still uncertain, but we certainly hope that the zoning updates will be completed before the next council election in 2026. So going back to the three key steps in the county's planning process, we've touched briefly on the general plan, we've touched briefly on zoning, and stay tuned for future webinars about zoning. I'm sure we'll be doing them. The focus tonight is this stage in the middle here, the APFO Review Committee. APFO stands for Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance, and the Review Committee is meeting right now to review and recommend changes to that ordinance. The committee was recently formed, and its first public hearing is actually 1 week from tonight on November 6th. And in this webinar, we're going to be sharing our recommendations for APFO changes that we plan to deliver to the APFO Review Committee, and we hope that you'll support those recommendations and weigh in various ways, as you'll hear a little bit later. But let's now dive into APFO a little more deeply and just start with a basic definition that comes from the Maryland Department of Planning. These ordinances are designed to slow the pace of development, or in extreme cases, delay development until adequate service levels are reasonably assured. And the APFO ordinances can be set up differently in different communities, but in Howard County, there are 3 tests for any proposed housing development. First, are there enough housing allocations available? Second, are there enough roads? And third, do the effective schools have enough capacity? And so let's look at each one of these tests in turn. Let's start with the housing allocations chart. This is literally a chart. I'll pull it up here, and this is most of it, but not quite all of it. This contains the housing development goals that were approved by the county council in the general plan, year by year. How many new homes can we expect to add in different areas of the county? And very importantly, the allocation chart includes a category for affordable homes as well. Again, these are targets, these are goals that were approved by the county council. This is the policy roadmap for the next 10 to 20 years for housing growth. So now, how does APFO get applied to proposed housing developments? First APFO test is, are there enough allocations in that chart for the development to actually proceed? So let's just imagine that you've purchased some land and you've come up with a plan to create a completely new townhouse community called Patuxent Greenway. This is absolutely fictional. I don't want anybody to get upset that they think this is going into their backyard. This is a fictional example. But you're proposing 85 townhomes and you submit the plan to DPZ, let's imagine 1 year from now. And literally the planners at DPZ go out and look at the housing allocations chart for 3 years in advance. This would be 2028, and they confirm, okay, there are some housing allocations available. You pass the first test. The second test is, what's the impact on roads? If your development includes more than 4 homes, you have to hire traffic engineers to test the capacity of all of the critical intersections within 1.5 miles. We would have to read a whole manual from the highway department about what a critical intersection is, but here's a layperson definition here at the bottom. So back to your mythical development, Patuxent Greenway, APFO Test 2 would require you to examine or have traffic engineers examine all the critical intersections up to 1 mile away in every direction. And if any intersection fails the test, it's deemed that it would be unsafe with the additional cars on the road from your community. You as the developer would have to pay for improvements. So that's APFO Test 2. And last, and very importantly, APFO Test 3 looks at school capacity. Is that going to be available to support the additional students that are living in your new townhouse community? Every year, the Board of Education creates and publishes a map, and it has to be approved by the county council, that shows where schools are considered to be over capacity. And on the map, you can see these areas. They're tan and some blue shading and some combinations of tan and blue shading. So in all of those areas that are filled in, 1 or more schools in that area are considered to be over capacity. So for this third APFO test, your community will be examined to see, okay, where is it located? What schools are going to be impacted by additional students coming from your development? And in this case, you would be building that development in an area where 1 or more schools are considered to be over capacity. And so when that happens, your development goes into what is called the waiting bin. It's basically just put on hold for retesting the following year. And you can't proceed with the development until the schools either have enough capacity or 4 years have passed. So if you are willing to wait around, and whoever you bought the land from, and maybe you have an option on the land, but you have not paid completely for it, if everybody's willing to wait that long, then the development can proceed after 4 years or sooner if school capacity is added. So those are the 3 APFO tests. Again, they're specific to Howard County, but fairly similar from community to community. And the way this is working today in Howard County, it has to be said, APFO has worsened our housing shortage that Jackie was describing early on. APFO has made it worse. And we can see that in this chart. It shows the number of new homes that were proposed starting from 2007 all the way through the early 2020s in 6-month increments. And what happened in 2019 was that APFO was amended to make the school capacity testing even stricter, and builders immediately began to scale back plans. And you can see that the amount of housing development that was proposed dropped significantly. In fact, before those changes in 2019, developers were proposing about 750 new homes every 6 months. After the changes to APFO, just 200 homes every 6 months were being proposed. So APFO definitely has slowed down housing development and worsened our housing shortage. And this slide, this chart, is another illustration of how APFO has contributed to that shortage. Since the start of APFO in the mid-90s, housing growth has been controlled by these APFO tests. And what this chart shows, the blue part of each bar, is where homes were put on hold because they failed the allocations test, meaning that there weren't enough housing allocations in that chart that were set out in our community's growth plan to support those new homes. So those homes had to be put on hold until allocations were freed up, and then the developments could presumably proceed. The red part of the bars shows the homes that failed the school capacity test, meaning that one or more schools in the area of those developments were closed because of overcapacity. And so those homes were put on hold. And what you can see looking forward along the timeline, in 2018, all of the housing delays have been caused entirely by a lack of school capacity. There's no blue in any of these bars, meaning that nothing's being held up for a lack of housing allocations. And to me, this chart really illustrates the mismatch between our policy goals and our capacity. The policy, forgive me, let me get you back there. The policy lays out more housing allocations than we've actually needed. We have not consumed all of the housing allocations that are available. What's slowing things up, what is slowing up new housing production, is the school capacity test in APFO. And unfortunately, if nothing changes, APFO is going to continue to worsen the housing shortage. So another map for you here. This is a kind of a high-level view from the general plan that shows the expected land usage over the next 20 years. And out in the west, you see these green shaded areas. Those represent either preserve space or agricultural space or large homes on big lots. And there are very minimal new residential opportunities in the West. You'll see that actually if you look at the housing allocations chart. There are very few homes expected or planned for in the West. In the East, the blue, purple, and red shading is showing the biggest opportunities for residential growth over the next 10 to 20 years. And I'm going to put some red circles up on the map. These highlight the location of what are called activity centers. In the general plan, these were called out as the opportunities for much denser residential, larger multifamily, which tend to be more affordable housing because they use the land more efficiently. And these activity centers offer the best opportunities for more affordable housing that we need in our community. So now let me just go back and overlay that school capacity map or overcapacity map. And again, just to remind you, the shaded areas, the tan and the striped areas, are places where one or more schools are considered to be overcapacity, and therefore developments would be delayed in those areas. So what happens to the big opportunities for residential and for affordable housing? Well, most of them go away or are delayed for a significant amount of time. And unfortunately, that represents, again, the essential conflict that we're struggling with in our community between our policy goals, which call for more housing and more affordable housing, and yet we keep struggling with these school capacity issues that are delaying and in some cases completely disincentivizing developers to try to build in Howard County. And with that context provided, let me turn things over to Kevin Chin.
Hi, my name is Kevin Chin. I'm going to go over some myths and misconceptions. I live in Ellicott City, and I'm on the Housing Coalition Steering Committee as well. I became interested in affordable housing because I work in healthcare and I see how the high cost of housing affects my patients' health, and I wanted to make a difference. Next slide. First myth, Howard County doesn't need housing growth. I hear from a lot of Howard Countians that if we only stop development and new people from coming in, we would have enough money to fund our schools. The truth is we cannot maintain our high quality schools, libraries, parks, and police without increasing our tax base. In fact, 91% of our tax revenue comes from the income tax and property tax. Our income tax is already the highest allowed in the state at 3.2%. Our property tax is the second highest in Maryland, 1.044%. 91%, that doesn't even count all the transfer tax from the sale of homes. Next slide. This chart is directly from the Howard County operating budget put out by the county executive and county council. You can see from these projections that we have some serious budget shortfalls in the coming years. By 2028, we will have over $1 billion in our budget gap. If that didn't scare you enough, we already have $1 billion capital improvement shortfall for our schools. When we get new residents, we increase our tax revenue through our property and income taxes, which help fund our great public services and schools. The Spending Affordability Advisory Committee of Howard County has a sober analysis. There are only 3 concrete solutions: raising taxes, cutting spending and services, or growing the tax base. So that leaves us with one solution, which is actually the desirable solution: grow the tax base by expanding the supply of housing, which our community desperately needs. If we don't do this, housing will become increasingly expensive, and we will have a community where only the very wealthy will be able to afford to live here. Next myth, school overcrowding is a countywide problem. We hear this a lot. We can't have more homes, our schools are already overcrowded. The truth is we are actually below capacity system-wide. In fact, half of our schools are at or below capacity. And side note, these are actually the 2022 numbers, so high schools are below the 100% with the addition of Guilford Park High School. And due to a variety of factors such as low birth rates, we are actually expected to remain essentially flat in the student population, even in 10 years, and this is per the analysis from the Howard County Public School System. The naysayers might say, hey, we're kind of close to 100%, let's just build another school so we're really below capacity. The truth is we cannot build schools without significant help from the state. The state funds approximately 50% of the cost of construction of a new school. And more importantly, the state does not give the green light to funds unless we are over capacity per the state's criteria. The state doesn't look at one particular overcrowded school. And yes, we do have a few overcrowded schools. It looks at all the neighboring schools in the county. If there are some overcapacity schools and some undercapacity schools, which is the case in Howard County, they will not give any funding because they require us to redistrict first. Next myth, new construction has the biggest impact on schools. We like to blame new construction as a source of school overcrowding, but the truth is the vast majority, in fact, 83% of new students are from the resale of existing apartments and single-family homes. If we really wanted to control new students coming in, we should ban the 70-year-old retiree from selling their home. That sounds absurd, doesn't it? Next myth. More rental housing will have a dramatic impact on schools. This is false. Most new homes that will be added in the future will be townhouses and apartments. These generate fewer students than single-family detached homes. For example, apartments generate only 0.1 students compared to 0.7 students for single-family homes. For example, the new apartments in the Meriwether district, the Juniper, they generate 0.06 students per apartment. From a purely financial perspective, this is a massive benefit for our tax base and our schools with the property and income taxes generated by each apartment, with very little cost in educating new students. This slide shows the planned growth of Howard County. As you can see, the majority of the growth is in apartments, which again generate many fewer students. As we said a few slides ago, the number of students will be relatively flat over the next 10 years, and this is per both our planning departments and our school system analyses. Next slide. I want to hammer home this simple point here. Housing development leads to an increase in property and income taxes, which then leads to more funding for all of our services as well as our schools. Over the past few slides, we've been making an intellectual and financial argument, but let me take a step back and make a moral one. While we as a county block housing, we are making it harder for our police officers, our librarians, our childcare providers, our teachers, and our children to live in this great high opportunity county. And regarding new students, what's wrong with giving students access to some of the best teachers in the country? This is not a zero-sum game between supporters of schools and housing. The truth is, per the financial analyst cited previously, we need more housing and growth to fund our schools and fix these billion-dollar budget shortfalls that are coming. And they are coming for us unless we make some changes. And leads to our next speaker, Jessamine Duval.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jessamine Duval. I've been a Howard County resident for 25 years. I live in Columbia, and I am the executive director of the Columbia Housing Center. We are a local nonprofit dedicated to sustaining integrated neighborhoods in and around Columbia. I'm also on the steering committee of the Housing Affordability Coalition. I'm going to tell you about the coalition's recommended changes to APFO. These recommendations were approved by our steering committee and will be included in our testimony at the public hearing on November 6th and detailed in a flyer that we will share with you after the webinar. Our first recommendation is to prioritize affordable housing by adopting mechanisms to make the development process more efficient. That's kind of a mouthful. In layman's terms, this means exempting new housing that meets certain criteria from the APFO schools test. You've seen how the APFO schools test can impact development, particularly in some of the areas that we have targeted for growth in Howard County. So one of our recommendations is we suggest exempting new mixed income, missing middle, and other affordable rental housing where at least 25% of the units are set aside for households earning less than 60% of their median income, or AMI, as it's often called, which is about $70,000 for a family of three. We would exempt those from the APFO schools test. The second recommendation is exempting new home ownership developments that include at least 25% of homes set aside for people earning no more than 80% of the Howard County median income. These would be folks earning between $55,000 and about $101,000 a year. Lastly, we would suggest exempting TOD, transit-oriented development projects, that qualify for a density bonus under Maryland's New Housing Expansion and Affordability Act. That's also a mouthful. This is basically housing that is built within 3/4 of a mile of a transit hub. We would ask that these projects, particularly in areas already designated as activity centers in HOCO by design, and those were the red and the areas in the red circles that Dana showed you, that particularly those would be exempted from the APFO school requirements. Eliminating the extra hurdle of the APFO schools test for some of this new housing that we desperately need will help us reduce the current housing gap by making these projects easier and faster to develop. As we've mentioned, we have an extreme housing shortage in Howard County right now, and most of all the projects that we would like to exempt from the APFO schools test meet the need to fill the gap of over 9,000 new affordable units that we need to build to meet the existing demand. And the majority, if not all of these, would be multifamily housing. Apartments or townhomes, which we just saw, generate fewer new students than single family homes. So that is prioritizing affordable housing. Our next recommendation involves identifying and creating new revenue sources to support both affordable housing and schools. So if we go back here to the state's definition of APFO, the state says that in order to be effective, APFO must be associated with a funding source to remedy the constraint on growth approval. And in this case, it's school capacity. As you saw, we have many, many schools that are overcrowded, according to APFO, and that there are many projects in the waiting bin because of this. So next slide. We are suggesting a possible revenue source for consideration by recommending changes to the transfer and recordation fees that are paid when a home is sold. So we have two options here to consider. One would be to simply increase one or both of these fees across the board. Our current tax rates are below the Baltimore metro area's average, so we have some wiggle room to increase them without having a major impact on home buyers and sellers. For example, we could increase the recordation tax, which is now $5 per $1,000, by $4 up to $9 per $1,000, which would match the Baltimore metro average. And the buyer and the seller of a home that sold for the Howard County average sales price of $675,000, so $445 would only pay an additional $1,350 at closing. So it would generate a lot of revenue with, again, it would not be a significant pinch to home buyers and sellers on the closing of a home. So the second option would be to restructure these fees to increase based on the final sales price of the home. This is something that I like to lovingly call the mansion tax. In this scenario, the tax rate for these fees would increase at a graduated rate based on the price of the home. The fees would likely go down or be the same for homes under $500,000. They would start to go up at a graduated increase for homes. Really, we would probably start, you see a significant difference around $800,000 homes or more. So this would generate a significant amount of revenue, and we would propose that that revenue is split equally between schools for all that deferred maintenance and for new schools construction, and affordable housing to create funds to build new affordable housing or to preserve existing housing. Next slide. So another way to generate more revenue for the county would be to change the school capacity limits used in the APFO schools test. The limits set by APFO determine when our county considers a school closed, meaning housing developments proposed in this school district will fail the schools test, like Dana showed you earlier. As you may recall, those development projects get sent to the waiting bin. They can retest annually, and it delays new housing by up to 4 years. So before 2019, an elementary or middle school was considered closed when it reached 115% of the county's designated capacity for that school. And there was actually no cap for high schools. When APFO was changed in 2019, those capacity limits were reduced to 105% for elementary schools, 110% for middle schools, and 115% for high schools. As we saw in the chart Dana showed earlier, this dramatically reduced the amount of housing being built and created the backlog of projects in the waiting bin. Therefore, we're proposing a return to the pre-2019 recommendations for the APFO schools test, which would allow more housing to pass that test and move forward. Okay, so how does this generate revenue? Well, Kevin briefly mentioned state funding for schools. In the briefest way to state it, state funding for a county school project is approved using a set of criteria, including whether the school is over what they call the state rated capacity. The state rated capacity is not the same as the capacity that the county sets for schools. So if a school isn't over the state rated capacity, the county will not qualify for help from the state to improve that school or build a new school. So if we close schools at a capacity below the state rated capacity, the county leaves state money on the table and the school will never become eligible for the state money. So when we reduced these caps in 2019, we sort of created this problem where I call it shooting ourselves in the foot. You saw the backlog of projects. Well, because the school capacity doesn't reach that state rated, it never reaches that state rated capacity, we're leaving that funding there. This especially impacts elementary schools. We have 42 elementary schools in Howard County. At 105% capacity, only 40% of the elementary schools exceed their state rated capacity. If we increase the cap to 115% for elementary schools, 69% of elementary schools would exceed the state rated capacity if they were at 115% capacity. And then the county could qualify for funds to improve, renovate, or build a new school. So changing APFO so that the schools close at 115% instead of the graduated numbers seen in this chart would make it easier for us to get funding from the state to build new schools or improve the schools that we have. Next. So I'm just going to recap what we said. That was a lot of talking and a lot of percentages and numbers, but the recap is essentially this. We want to prioritize affordable housing by exempting new developments with significant amounts of affordable rental or home ownership opportunities and certain new transit-oriented development projects from the APFO schools test as a matter of right. Just for the record, a lot of affordable housing projects are currently being exempted from the APFO schools test, but we have to use a waiver process. It takes about 4 months. So by excluding them as a matter of right, it would speed up the development of those affordable homes. And we would find new revenue sources to support affordable housing in our schools by enabling access to more state funding for schools by updating the schools test and increasing or restructuring transfer and recordation taxes on home sales. So those are the Housing Affordability Coalition's recommended improvements to APFO. We hope you'll support them and help us advocate for their implementation. And I'll now hand it over to Jackie Eng, who will tell you how you can have your voice heard on this issue.
So how to advocate for our APFO recommendations and any other ideas that you all have that you want to share with the APFO committee. So as Dana mentioned earlier, the APFO review committee is currently meeting. They are expected to be finished and need to present their recommendations to the county council by May. They will be holding 2 public hearings. The first one will be to receive ideas, such as we've been talking about tonight, from the public, and that's next Wednesday, November 6th, that's 7 p.m. The second one, we're not sure, but we anticipate will be when they have recommendations, and they will present those to the public for response. But that's not till the spring. We just want to make sure that we all get our ideas on the table as they are doing their deliberations. So how can you advocate with the committee? Attend the public hearing next week. We would really appreciate if you would support the coalition's recommendations, and there's a couple of ways to do that. We will be also sending to you a letter that it's a draft letter that will be sent to the APFO review committee. That will go to them, and we'll give you a framework, and you can add if you would like your thoughts, your ideas, or you can just sign on and send it, and you'll be getting that tomorrow. You can also testify yourself at the public hearing, and we encourage you to do so. And again, and you do that, there's a sign up online. We'll be sending this out. It'll be in the slide deck, but we'll make sure that everybody knows how to sign up to testify, or you can sign up at the door, or you can email your testimony into your testimony. It can be formal. It can just be some thoughts. It's up to you to communicate however you would like to, but we will make sure that your thoughts and ideas that we know about will get conveyed to the APFO committee. We would ask that you share the slide deck information, your ideas with your networks. And if you want to, and we encourage you to attend in person, just to kind of show up and show that there is community interest in the APFO, the work of the APFO review committee, or you can just watch it, and there's a website. It'll be transmitted live on the night of the hearing.
Jackie, let me just run through this one quickly. So Jackie mentioned the letter campaign. We would love for you to sign on to that. And Jess is going to drop the link to the letter campaign actually into the chat window. So you'll get it even before tomorrow, sooner than Jackie promised. So this is the link. And when you go to the link, you'll see a page that looks like this, and a little bit of explanation about what you're doing. Click the Start Writing button over here on the right, and basically it'll bring up our proposed letter, and you can just immediately sign your name onto that letter. But you also are free to modify the letter if you want to add your own ideas.
And I think that brings us to questions. There have been a few questions in the Q&A section here.
Diva's question, we tried on the recordation fee and it failed with this council. What is new this time around?
I'll kind of start with that one. There is no question that raising fees, taxes, anything is politically, is not politically acceptable to our administration and council. We understand that. The thing that's different this time, I think, is that we are now looking and really becoming aware of, number one, our shortage of affordable housing, our needs in our school systems. And I think that that might push things, maybe open some minds. But also the reality is that we're facing, according to a couple of different sources, that we're facing a projected significant budget shortfall in the next few years. So if we don't start doing something now, I have no idea how we're going to meet those shortfalls. So just hoping that the environment is a little bit different to be more open to these ideas.
I'm new to Howard County, but I have heard from several people that, especially I live in Columbia, that out in the county, people are very up in arms about affordable housing because they're very concerned about the impact on their schools and their children, the sort of NIMBY. And I like your plan, but I think that people are gonna fight it.
I think that's a fair concern, and we think people are going to fight it too. We are hoping that by having some really valid and recent data that really illustrates the effect of the current APFO on our ability both to improve and build new schools and build more sorely needed housing, that maybe people's minds will start to change. Like Jackie said, it's a slightly different environment. I mean, I don't think I know anyone who hasn't been personally impacted by the housing crisis, whether it's a family member, a coworker, or themselves. So I feel like we are getting more and more people to recognize the need. And that's why we want to dispel those myths, to help people understand, because I think a lot of times there's a lot of fear that's based on not really having all the information. So our goal is to provide so much information that it becomes crystal clear what the solution to the problem is.
That's great. And I think Kevin's presentation in particular was very impactful.
Thank you.
I believe that there was a comment in the Q&A section that, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten who asked it, but as they go through Columbia, they're not seeing less impact on schools. And I think it's important to recognize that the data we present that we have, there certainly is individual school data, but we're talking about system-wide data and trying to look at the bigger picture, meaning that some areas may be overcrowded, but with targeted redistricting or a couple of other approaches that we might be able to alleviate those. But Columbia clearly is the center of the most compact housing, the most housing in our community, and affordable housing. And that's just the way it's been. And we have argued, and many others are arguing, that whatever new housing is developed should be dispersed through the county, which will help alleviate and not add additional burden challenge to the Columbia area.
Another thing that I would add is that hearkening back to the idea of the mismatch between policy goals, which have been clearly in the general plan to bring more housing into Howard County, especially housing dedicated for people earning below 60% AMI. These are school teachers, childcare workers, hospitality workers, a lot of construction trades are below that level. So these are people who are, part of the fabric of the community every bit as much as people who live out in the West or anywhere else. in the community. That's who we're talking about needs affordable housing. And we're talking about housing that best case doesn't come online. It's not occupied for 5 to 6 to 7 years from today. And so stopping those processes from occurring because we're not able to plan over the for additional school capacity over the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, to me is it's shocking that we would be thinking that way. We have to be getting ahead of the capacity issues that we've had so that we can make room for the housing that our community needs.
The question Regina asked is, if the housing development is for seniors, do you have to go to test number 3? And Jackie answered that it would not be an issue. I do think that senior housing does not have to go through the APFO test, the schools test, because they have restrictions on children being able to live there. So that's my understanding. We could probably verify that with DPZ to make sure that that's correct, but that's my understanding of how that works. Susan asked, I may have missed this, but was there any information tonight about where housing can be built, i.e. where is vacant land? So I believe the figure is that only 2% of the county's remaining land is buildable right now. Everything else has either been preserved or is already built on. I could verify that figure, but I know it's a very small amount of vacant land that can be built on right now. So we're talking about a lot of redevelopment. We're talking about infill development, going back to sort of filling in where, and redoing older buildings.
That's going to have to be in redevelopment. And that's, Dana referenced this about how in HOCO by design, we as a county decided to designate certain areas for growth, like activity centers. So this is certain areas along, Route 40, some areas where the old village centers are. And, that comes into conflict between where we're not allowed to build. So, we have kind of two opposing things right now, and that we've said as a county.
One question came up for apartments. Does APFO differentiate between studio and 1-bedroom apartments and larger ones that may have children? No, it does not. It's the whole project that has to pass the schools test. So even if 70% of it was studios and 1-bedrooms and they were just a handful of apartments that would be large enough for folks to have kids in them, it would still have to meet the schools test. Diva had another question about the $2,625 2-bedroom, 2-bath number for rent, the mean or the medium. I think that's the average. Is that right? Do you remember, Dana?
I think that is the average from Housing and Community.
I think it's the average.
Yes. Yeah. The median is not much lower. Let's put it that way. It's not much lower. I think it's for 2-bedroom, the median, the last I looked was like maybe 2,250, 2,300 around there, something like that.
Thank all of you for attending, listening intently. Lots of names that I recognize on our attendance list, and just kind of bless you for hanging in for as many years as we've all been kind of fighting this battle. And sincere welcome to any newcomers, and hope that you'll consider joining the coalition so that we can ensure that we stay in communication with you and vice versa. And again, thanks to everyone, and hope to see many of you next Wednesday night at the 50 Plus Center in East Columbia at 7 o'clock for the review committee. It'll be an interesting evening for all of us, I know. Thank you, everyone.
Good night, all.
Thank you so much, everyone.